'Cause you're trying to stay strong.
Part 1.
Ielts practice. Questions 1 and 2. You will hear a tutor and some students discussing science and ethics. You should answer the questions as you listen because you will not hear the recording a second time. Listen carefully and answer questions 1 and 2. And answer questions 1 and 2.
In the 19th century, scientific discoveries took a long time to produce any actual applications, and scientists might have had a case for giving little thought to the social or environmental impact of their work. That all changed in the 20th century, with the huge advances first in physics and then in biology. Science started to play a much more important role in our lives, and the relationship between scientists and society became much closer. Many scientists became increasingly concerned about the ethics of what they were doing, as they quickly saw the consequences. The benefits, such as vastly improved crop yields and the eradication of diseases like bubonic plague, but also terrible damage in the form of pollution and chemical weapons.
Yes, but some scientists still claim even today that their only duty is to make public the findings of their research. They need to do that, of course, but I think the key points are that they ought to stop making any distinction between pure science and applied science, because in practical terms it no longer exists. And also, they must accept full responsibility for the consequences of their work.
Now listen and answer questions 3 to 10. Now listen and answer questions 3 to 10.
Let's explore that last point a little further. How can scientists put that responsibility into practice?
By educating the public, particularly through the media and at the workplace.
Another thing they must do is advise on what might one day go wrong as a result of what they're coming up with now.
That seems essential. And just as importantly, if and when things do go wrong, they need to sort them out, especially where the fault lies with the original research.
How do you feel about the international role of scientists, given that their work crosses frontiers so readily?
I think it gives them, or at least should give them, a global view. In this respect, some of them are better placed than many politicians to see how new discoveries are likely to affect particular parts of the world.
But will the politicians listen?
Probably not. But I'm not suggesting getting involved with politics or politicians. Much better to raise the public's awareness of scientific issues so they can put the pressure on at election time.
There's a problem here, though, isn't there, with the way the public sees scientists. They're all either mad or bad.
That's something they need to work on, definitely. To regain public trust, they'll have to show they're accountable, and that science is about improving people's lives.
That may not be so easy. What do you think are the areas in science that really worry people these days?
Science in agriculture, above all. There's been all this media hysteria about Frankenstein foods, but there is a genuine issue here. Whether adding specific genes to plants is a valid way of increasing food production, or whether it risks the appearance of new diseases, of superweeds and pests.
Which links it to another controversy, using chemicals to control pests. And that's something else that was at first thought to be harmless, but we now know that the careless spraying of crops has led to all kinds of health problems for people. Plus a devastating loss of biodiversity, with huge numbers of insects, birds and mammals simply disappearing from the countryside, fish dying in poisoned rivers and so on.
And of course, if we're talking about death on a massive scale, then we have to mention the role of science in enabling the military to wage chemical and biological and nuclear warfare, which has destroyed life in so many parts of the world.
Okay, I think we've identified some major topics there.
There's something I'd like to add, if I may. Sure, it's important for scientists and future scientists to talk about major issues like these, but we might also want to look at what we can do or not do in our everyday lives, particularly as many of us will be earning more money than we actually need for basic necessities. I'm thinking here of things like burning fossil fuels by driving everywhere. What do you think?
Well, something that scientists seem to do rather too often is take planes to distant places, which is highly damaging environmentally.
For instance, to attend conferences on subjects like the disappearing ozone layer.
When nowadays they could probably stay at work and use a video conferencing link anyway.
Which may in fact be an example of how progress in computer science can impact positively on the environment.
But going back to harmful things, what else can be done?
Again, on the air transport theme, there are the huge distances a lot of consumer goods travel before they actually reach the shops in this country. This seems another extreme waste of energy, especially if much of what is being produced and carried is packaging. Perhaps it's worth shopping for more locally produced items.
That is the end of part 1.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Part 2.
You will hear part of a local radio program about fighting air pollution in Canadian towns. First, you have some time to look at questions 11 to 14. Now listen carefully and answer questions 11 to 14.
Good morning, folks, and welcome to the information roundup on your own local radio station. This is Larry Knowles talking to you this morning on Tuesday, the 25th of May. And the first item coming up is a reminder to you all out there about Canadian Clean Air Day, which is on June 6th. In case you weren't around for the last one, this is a chance for Canadians everywhere to focus on the problems of air pollution and to actually try to do something to help reduce the problem. How many Canadians do you think die annually because of air pollution? 2,000? 3,000? Well, the rate is a staggering 5,000, and it's likely to grow unless we do something. And it's this concern with your health that's the driving force behind the government campaign that is sponsoring Clean Air Day. So what causes air pollution in the first place? Well, the transportation sector accounts for 27% of all greenhouse gases produced in Canada. It's also the biggest source of that thick, polluted air from traffic fumes that we call smog. And it's the tiny particles and ground-level ozone in smog that are the main causes of health problems and even deaths across the country. Of course, it's worse in the big cities, but researchers have only recently realized that all you need are low levels of air pollution to seriously damage your health, so we're all at risk.
You now have some time to look at questions 15 to 20. Now listen and answer questions 15 to 20.
So, what can we do to fight air pollution? Well, it should be pretty obvious by now that the way we get to and from work every day can have a big impact on the air we breathe. So the easiest action you can take on Clean Air Day is to accept what we call the commuter challenge and get to work on foot or by cycling for a change. If you have to use your car, try carpooling and share the drive, or better still, use public transit. If everyone tries this for just one day, you'll be amazed by the difference it can make to the air in our towns and cities. But there's more you can do to improve air quality. For example, you can plant trees. And if you don't have a garden, then you can do your bit in other ways. For instance, did you know that modern, improved wood stoves can reduce wood smoke by as much as 80 to 90%? So you can make a big difference if you upgrade the appliances you use in your home. The government is also working hard on your behalf to clean up our air. Its priority is to reduce the emissions that cause smog, and they have clear plans to get there. Last year, Canada and the United States agreed to reduce emissions on both sides of the border between the two countries, and they plan to reach their targets in the next few years. The government's also taking action to get cleaner fuels. It's already reduced the sulfur contained in gasoline, and it hopes to reach the reduction target for sulfur in diesel by next year. But the measures don't just focus on the motorist. The federal government's also working to reduce emissions from power plants and factories right across the provinces. You can find out all about government action and all the plans for Clean Air Day events.
That is the end of part 2.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 3. Part 3.
You are going to hear a conversation on animal protection. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 25. Now listen to the tape and answer the questions.
Thanks for joining us today, Mike. How did Baja California become a consideration for a condor release?
Our recovery plan for California condors requires us to re-establish the birds in as much as their former range as possible. Baja, being the southernmost recent range for the California condor, works well in that they were only recently lost from the area, mid-1930s, and considerable habitat still remains. It is very isolated with very few people in the area. The mountains are spectacular, ranging up to 10,000 feet, or 3,000 meters. Our selected release site is at nearly 8,000 feet, 2,400 meters.
Mike, how many birds do you envision flying free in this area, Baja, in the future?
We will be releasing 4 to 8 birds on a yearly basis and will reconsider the situation when we have 20 birds in the area.
What age do the birds have to be before moving them?
That's a good question. Typically, we move them at 8 months to 18 months old. Birds are ready to fledge, or leave, from the nest at 6 to 7 months of age. In our current release group in Baja, we have birds as old as 30 months. It will be interesting to see how they behave. I expect that they will want to range more than younger birds and make it challenging for us to keep up.
Is there a maximum number of birds a certain area can support?
Yes, it's called the carrying capacity for any area, for for any species. In our case, our strategy to find that number is to saturate the environment to a level where we determine that the birds are showing difficulty either in finding food, behaviourally, or in survivorship. That level is greatly determined by the availability of food in the area and nesting possibilities.
Now look at questions 26 to 30. As the talk continues, answer questions 26 to 30.
What do you hope to accomplish with this release in the long run?
I expect that well within 10 years the condors will be flying north and joining birds already released in Southern California. Hopefully we will reach at least 150 birds in each of these populations within about 15 years.
What would you say is the biggest contribution to the California Condor program's success?
That would have to be the fact that we were able to breed the birds in captivity from the 27 birds we started with in 1987 to the 205 birds we have today. This is thanks to cooperation between the San Diego Wild Animal Park, the Los Angeles Zoo, and the World Center for Birds of Prey in Boise, Idaho.
Are there any problems keeping track of and protecting your released animals outside of the US?
Nope. We are using radio transmitters and will be using the new satellite and GPS transmitters as well.
Which system is better?
Using satellites. The advantages over radio telemetry are numerous. It makes it possible to keep up with the bird's flight without being led miles in a matter of minutes. It took the young condor only a week to migrate across the state, and with just radio telemetry, poor weather can keep a plane grounded, and not all roads are accessible to track them on ground. New technology will allow one to be able to track birds that are not accessible by plane. Also, it is a new way to gauge the effectiveness of reintroduction.
How so?
If a condor transmitter works properly, researchers will get a location every 10 days for about 2 years.
Do you see an end in sight for the need to breed condors in captivity?
Yes, that would be great. But it will take a while for us to establish the two wild populations and make sure that they are sustainable. Part of our recovery is to maintain a captive flock of 150 birds in various zoos around the country as a safety net for the future.
That is the end of part 3.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 4.
Part 4.
You will hear a presentation by a student about a website she has designed for a supermarket. First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 40 on pages 113 and 114. Now listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 40.
For my website design project, I decided to approach SuperSave supermarkets because I have an evening job at the supermarket, so I already have a slight insight into their organisational goals and workings. The field research for my project was in 2 stages. First, I had an interview with Mr. Dunn, who is in charge of SuperSave's customer care department. I discussed the project with him in order to identify the supermarket's requirements. Mr. Dunn said customers are often unwilling to make a face-to-face complaint when they've experienced difficulties with a product or a member of staff or anything related to the supermarket. So he said a website which allowed members of the public to get in touch with the organisation and bring the problem to their attention in a private manner might be very useful, and we agreed that I'd work on this. For the second stage of my research, I devised a questionnaire to put to SuperSave customers. I needed to find out about the customers' experiences of problems together with their attitudes towards making complaints, both directly and indirectly. I used a mixture of closed questions, such as, have you ever experienced a problem at any SuperSave store? And open questions, such as, what would you find helpful about a customer complaint website? I decided to do interviews rather than rely on distribution of the questionnaire, as I felt this was likely to lead to a higher take-up rate. I visited 4 SuperSave stores, 2 in the city centre and 2 in the outskirts, and altogether I interviewed 101 respondents. Then finally, I analysed the results. I found the results of the questionnaires to be very informative. I found that out of the total number of customers investigated, 64% had at some stage encountered a problem in a SuperSave store. Out of these people, the vast majority said that they hadn't reported the problem to any member of staff. They just kept it to themselves. The next thing I tried to find out was why they hadn't complained. Well, about 25% of the people I interviewed said the reason was that they couldn't be bothered, and a slightly smaller percentage said that they didn't have enough time. But 55% said the reason was that they felt intimidated. I finally asked if they would be more likely to complain if they didn't have to do it face-to-face, and nearly everyone I asked said that they would, 95% to be exact. I then set about designing the website to meet these needs. Once I'd completed the website, I made another appointment with Mr. Dunn to find out what he thought of it. Mr. Dunn said he felt that the pages would benefit his organisation by giving customers a new way of expressing their complaints and by making it easier to collect complaints, identify specific places where service and customer care were not as good as they should be, and act upon them accordingly. SuperSave is already a highly customer-orientated organisation, and he thought our website would be an excellent addition to their customer care effort. This is all well and good, but there still remains the general problem with websites, that there's a lack of access to online computers. Surprisingly, in my survey, I found that 88% of those interviewed had access to the internet, which I felt was quite high. But this access wasn't always direct. For some people, it was through their children and grandchildren and neighbours and so on, rather than being readily available in their own homes. This could prove to be a major drawback to the site, but it is still better to have it now to get the edge over competitors, however slight, and in the very near future, it is expected that almost everyone will have direct access to the internet. Another thing to consider is that at the moment I can only base our conclusions on data gathered from a tiny fraction of the supermarket's customer base. In order to get a better idea of how the site is doing and to see how well I have met my objectives, the site will need to have been up and running for at least a few months. After this time, it'll be possible to see whether or not people are actually using the site and if it's helping to make improvements to their customer service. It would also be interesting to study the effect of the site on staff at the supermarket. Morale could be dented as more complaints come in. Staff may feel they are being unfairly criticised and that there is no need for another way for customers to complain. But also, the site could boost morale by making staff come together to overcome the constructive criticism, and they may gain more job satisfaction by knowing that they are making a difference to the customer. So, overall, I feel my website has met my objectives, but there is scope for improvement and expansion. Are there any questions?
That is the end of part 4.
I know you told your friend you're not okay, and tell me what's wrong and why you never said you felt that way. And guess you're trying to stay strong and fake a smile until I look away. But I've known you too long, it hurts to